Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm Caleb Rossico, Project Manager for the Atlanta Zoning Ordinance Rewrite Consultant Team. I'd like to welcome you to this video to review our work to date analyzing the city's patterns. The presentation is intended to provide a broad overview of the process and then review key findings that might be used to guide the city's new zoning ordinance. Our work was pretty technical, and this is intended to be only a summary. However, if you'd like to go into more detail, please watch the companion video on the project website or review the materials there as well. We hope that this analysis will give Atlanta residents, businesses, and property owners some food for thought as we embark on this historic effort to update the city's zoning code. When we use the word pattern to describe a city, we're talking about the physical features that define the place. In the case of Atlanta, things like the arrangement of streets, lot size or shape, the size and layout of buildings on lots, natural features like trees, creeks, topography, or parks, and different types of uses in housing are all patterns that make Atlanta what it is today. Many of these patterns are directly regulated or shaped by the zoning ordinance. This is why it's important to look closely at the patterns found in Atlanta today before considering new regulations that might affect them. Sometimes the existing pattern may be something the community wants to preserve and protect. Other times it may be something the community wants to change. In either case, zoning can be a powerful tool to achieving the desired outcome. This is especially critical given the tremendous amount of growth projected to occur over the next 30 years. By 2050, the city is expected to grow from 500,000 today to 1.2 million. This growth is expected to occur in all quadrants of the city, and if we don't have the proper tools to accommodate it in a way that respects and protects the city's greatest assets, we risk losing the very things that make Atlanta, Atlanta. The Atlanta City Design provides a vision for how to accommodate growth in a way that builds upon the city's history, ecology, and development patterns. It identifies directing the most of the new growth into existing activity centers, including downtown, midtown, and Buckhead, around existing and future transit, and along major corridors that traverse the city. These areas are intended to be more dense, walkable, and mixed use. The rest of the city is identified for conservation. This includes Atlanta's diverse, often wooded neighborhoods and certain industrial districts. Growth and change will still occur in these areas, but at a much smaller increment than in growth areas. In recent decades, the city has made great strides in updating its zoning ordinance within these growth areas. New zoning districts have been adopted for many growth centers across the city, extending from Greenbrier and Fort McPherson in the south, through downtown and midtown, and up to Buckhead and Lenox in the north. At the same time, proactive rezoning changes along the Atlanta Beltline and major growth corridors have rezoned hundreds of acres from older, auto-oriented, and suburban districts to newer, quality-of-life ones. As a result, most of these growth areas are now zoned for walkable, mixed-use development at a variety of scales, depending on the context. If you look around Atlanta, you'll see this growth occurring in many different growth areas and in many different neighborhoods. From Adair Park and the West End, into downtown, especially the Centennial Yards project, which many of us call the Gulch, and then up through Midtown and Buckhead, where cranes are an everyday sight. Common to all of this development are requirements of the newer zoning districts that call for buildings to be pulled to the street, to actually front the sidewalk with windows and doors and active uses like shops, restaurants, housing, or offices, and then requirements that developers upgrade the sidewalk and streetscape as they build the projects. However, unlike growth areas, most of the city's conservation areas have not seen any updates to their zoning requirements since the code was originally adopted in the early 1980s. In neighborhoods across Atlanta, growth has shown that the kind of development permitted under these current regulations is not always consistent with the Atlanta City Design, especially its vision of allowing growth in a way that respects the existing patterns and recognizes that there are differences between urban, suburban, and rural conservation areas in the city. Because so many of the conservation areas in Atlanta have zoning requirements that are over 40 years old, we decided to look very closely at the existing patterns of these areas, including their relationship to zoning, in order to identify opportunities for potential updates that would better meet the needs of diverse neighborhoods. This process included looking at the existing patterns at 4 scales: the city, the neighborhood, the block, and the building. The process of analyzing Atlanta's existing patterns was highly technical and used data from a variety of public and private sources. It also required a significant amount of fieldwork from our local team members. The analysis looked at many things, including the idea of a zoning nonconformity, or a term used by city planners to describe when a property doesn't comply with the actual regulations of the zoning code. Our analysis of nonconformity then looked at 2 types: form and use. A form nonconformity is one where something physical about the property doesn't meet the zoning requirement. That could be that the property is too tiny, the property is covered by higher percentage of building than otherwise required, or the property is too dense in terms of floor area ratio or building height. It could also be that the building is located closer to the property line than the zoning otherwise permits. The second type of nonconformity that we looked at was use. Use nonconformities generally fall into 2 categories. The first category is what we've called a land use nonconformity. This refers to properties that may be zoned residential but are used for commercial, such as the image before you in Virginia Highland. There's another type of use nonconformity that relates to the number of dwelling units. This nonconformity is very common in areas that are zoned single-family today, but at one time permitted apartments or duplexes or those sort of things. So as we conducted the analysis, both of these were very important to understand. At this scale, our form analysis found that many conservation areas do not conform to the zoning ordinance. This is especially true with regard to lot size. Many neighborhoods have lots that are smaller than otherwise required by the zoning today. This lot size disconnect creates a challenge to ensuring that new development matches existing character. Because the zoning ordinance is based on lots that are bigger than actually exist, the setbacks and lot coverage and other what we like to call metrics in the code cannot physically be accommodated on many properties, or if they do occur, they tend to result in development that doesn't match the existing pattern. The citywide analysis also found that use nonconformities exist but are not as common. They tend to be clustered in neighborhoods that are older or near the Atlanta Beltline, where you'll see things like multifamily buildings or corner stores or quadplexes and duplexes that are not otherwise permitted by the zoning today. From this citywide analysis, we then identified 19 representative study areas with a high degree of nonconformity for further review. These were spread across the city in a variety of NPUs and council districts. They included a wide variety of conservation areas, including rural, suburban, and urban, and then also included a variety of existing zoning districts, ranging from R1 through R5. Within each study area, we then looked very closely at the neighborhood structure, which refers to the layout of the lots and the streets, and the land use within them. The image before you is of the West End Westview study area, and you can again see a wide variety of land use, access to parks, and then proximity to transit, major corridors, the Atlanta Beltline, and growth areas. The neighborhood scale also looked at lot size, and it was of note that many neighborhoods in Atlanta are made up of a wide variety of lot sizes. And the reason for this is that few neighborhoods were actually master planned. Rather, they were a collection of independent subdivisions that connected over time to form the city we know today. And because many Atlanta neighborhoods grew organically over time and have a wide variety of lot sizes, there tends to be a great degree of nonconformity between the overall general zoning that applies to the entire neighborhood and the actual ability to meet that zoning on an individual lot. And again, the graphic before you shows the West End, Westview study area, and you can see that certain streets in certain parts of the neighborhood conform quite well, while others, shown in red or darker orange, do not. Similarly, the neighborhood scale analysis looked at where the number of housing units on a property exceeded what was required by the zoning ordinance. And as expected, there are several neighborhoods where you have historic apartment buildings or historic duplexes or historic quadplexes that are not otherwise permitted today. And when you add all of these things up, you get a great appreciation for just how hard it would be to build West End or Westview under the current zoning. These two neighborhoods are at least 59% nonconforming today, but very likely much higher when you factor in setbacks. And because setbacks require a finer scale of analysis, we then conducted a block analysis of 10 blocks across the city, choosing those that were in urban conservation areas because these tended to be the areas where the zoning was most incompatible with what was actually built today. The block scale analysis looked at the history of the block, or when the buildings on it were built. It looked at the lot size nonconformity. It looked at intensity, or whether or not the lots were the width required by the zoning or had the amount of floor area required by the zoning. It looked very closely at setbacks to understand whether or not buildings were too close to the street, too close to the side, too close to the rear, again, based on what the zoning would require. The block scale analysis also got into issues of character, identifying building types found within Atlanta's neighborhoods. Circulation was also considered, including whether or not there were alleys, whether they were used, and how parking was accessed. And then all of this collectively was able to document how well individual blocks across the city did or did not meet the zoning requirements. The final scale was the building scale. Within the study area blocks, representative building types were identified and analyzed in terms of how they related to the street, how tall they were, how they related to the side yard, the percentages of windows they had, and other features. We looked at carriage houses, which were found in several neighborhoods, older detached houses that were built before the current zoning existed, and newer ones that were built since the zoning was created. We even looked at walk-ups, these historic apartment buildings that are found throughout the city that are often no longer permitted under current zoning, and then shop fronts that also are found throughout many neighborhoods but are no longer easily permitted under the zoning ordinance today. From this analysis of conservation areas at the city scale, the neighborhood scale, the block scale, and the building scale, we were able to reach several conclusions about both the existing patterns of Atlanta neighborhoods and the current zoning ordinance. The first takeaway is that the current zoning ordinances that apply in the growth areas tend to work very well. They tend to support the Atlanta city design, the comprehensive development plan, and various other city policies and neighborhood plans. As a result, in these areas, the zoning ordinance rewrite might want to focus on improving clarity, usability, and small technical cleanups. However, in conservation areas, the current zoning ordinance doesn't do as good a job at consistently reflecting existing patterns and supporting neighborhood and city plans. A lot of this has to do with the fact that the current zoning ordinance is very suburban. Many of the regulations and rules in it are specifically intended to encourage suburban-type development within the city of Atlanta. This means that the code tends to work very well in areas of the city that actually have this pattern or where that pattern is appropriate. But it doesn't work as well in the rural areas of the city or in the urban ones. As an example of this, in the rural areas, which include parts of Buckhead along the Chattahoochee River and then parts of southwest Atlanta, extreme topography, creeks, and other natural features are really not considered in the R1 and R2 zoning that applies there. As a result, development can often have more grading or more disruption of the natural environment than might otherwise be appropriate. At the same time, these rural areas tend to be seeing the largest new homes in the city. And many of these homes are in fact larger than commercial establishments. But because they're residential, the zoning offers no protection for adjacent homeowners. And what that means is that if a pharmacy were to develop next to a house, there'd be buffer requirements, there'd be screening requirements, there'd be light pollution requirements. But because these houses are residential and they're the same use as the adjacent house, no such provisions apply. In urban conservation areas, the disconnect between existing zoning and built patterns is even greater. In fact, many of Atlanta's urban neighborhoods, including almost every neighborhood along and inside the Atlanta Beltline, could not be built today. This means that a developer or a homeowner who wants to build something that actually matches the character of their neighborhood often has to spend time and money seeking variances to do that. In the worst case scenario, properties are developed under the current zoning and it's extremely incompatible with everything around it. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this has to do with the non-conforming lot sizes, or the fact that lot sizes are smaller than required by zoning, which in turn informs setbacks, informs lot coverage, informs parking setbacks, and more. The current zoning ordinance also does a poor job at reflecting the patterns of how to transition between different uses or different intensities of uses. Historically, things like small apartment houses or homes or alleys or screening provided a wide variety of transitional options. Today, however, the only acceptable solution in the zoning ordinance is a 20-foot landscape buffer. A landscape buffer is a very suburban idea that works well in suburban ideals, but it is not something that matches the historic patterns of walkable neighborhoods that we see in much of Atlanta. Closely related to this, one of the main disconnects between the existing patterns in Atlanta and the current zoning is in fact the idea of the use of property. Many of our pre-World War II neighborhoods contained a very fine-grained mix of buildings, uses, housing types, and more, all with a common scale, a common relationship to the street, and a common form. This fine-grained mix of uses can be found across the city, but is typically concentrated in older neighborhoods like the West End, English Avenue, Vine City, Midtown Garden District, Grant Park, Mechanicsville, and several others. The current zoning often makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to upgrade these buildings without seeking a rezoning, going through a variance, or using another complicated technique. As a result, historic properties often sit vacant for years on end, and neighborhoods that may want to support or preserve this kind of character or establish it new don't really have the tools that would be best suited to do that. Finally, the existing pattern analysis found that the current zoning ordinance does not do a consistently good job of shaping the design of buildings. And I'm not talking about architectural style or material, but rather how the buildings actually engage the street, how they handle parking, and how they relate to surrounding buildings. In conservation areas, a lot of this also has to do with considering the topography of Atlanta and the trees in Atlanta. We hope this analysis has given you some food for thought as we work together to rewrite the city zoning ordinance. Over the coming year, there will be many opportunities for you to help us decide which patterns should be supported by the zoning ordinance and which patterns should be discouraged. This work will help us further define what exactly it means to accommodate future growth while preserving what makes Atlanta, Atlanta. We'll look at many different tools, such as updates to existing zoning districts, the potential creation of whole new zoning districts, new and updated standards, and we hope to identify potential sites across the city where we can test out these ideas. Together, the Department of City Planning and the Zoning Rewrite Consulting Team look forward to working with you in these important discussions. You can learn more by visiting the project website at www.atlzoning.com. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send an email to atlzoning2@atlantagA.gov. We look forward to hearing from you, and we thank you for your time.